Hey, it's Sela Social Studies.
Hey guys, welcome back to Sela Social Studies. The last time I left you off, we were talking about Chapter 14, which happened to be the second wave of immigration, the big urbanization of the United States, and people moving from farmlands into cities to take unskilled factory labor. We're talking about labor unions coming up, the Irish, the Germans, and now we're going to be talking about something that happens between pretty much the years of 1840 and into 1860, which would be the beginning of the Civil War. We're going to talk about the sectionalism. We're going to talk about the division of the United States and about 4 or 5 different topics about what really fractured the United States of America. And they are all based upon really slavery, some representation, but really it's all going to be about slavery. So the first one we're going to get into today is the Compromise of 1850. If you remember when we were talking about previously, we talked about the Missouri Compromise in 1820. And if you remember what happened with the Missouri Compromise of 1820, Missouri met all the qualifications from the Northwest Ordinance of 1787 to become a state. So Missouri would have been the 23rd state. There was 11 free states, 11 slave states. Missouri would have made the 12th slave state. And remember what I've been saying throughout this chapter or throughout this class. What we're talking about prior to the Civil War, most things in our country were revolving around, number 1, slavery, number 2, representation. This is another one of those things that representation was really at the heart of the issue. So the Missouri Compromise, Missouri was like, hey guys, I want to be a state and I want to become a slave state. So those northern abolitionist states were like, what are we going to do? Hey, I got an idea. Massachusetts was like, I'll just chop off that big part of my land up in the Northeast, slice it off. We'll call it Maine. Maine will enter as a free state. We will allow Missouri to come in as a slave state. But then all the legislatures were like, well, what next? What's going to happen next? Are we going to have more land that we can chop off to make more states? So they were like, oh my gosh, what are we going to do? Missouri, slave state, Maine, free state. And they remember they drew that 3630 line, that slavery scar in the United States that you see on that picture. And what was going to happen was everything above that line, new territories, new states, they were going to be free states. Everything below that line, they were going to be open to slavery. So President Polk actually wanted to extend that 3630 line all the way to the Pacific Ocean. Other leaders wanted to use popular sovereignty, and we've learned what popular sovereignty was, the idea of voting for something, like voting for your leaders, voting for if you want slavery or anything like that. That was popular sovereignty. They wanted popular sovereignty. That's a key word. That's why I'm repeat. Popular sovereignty, the idea that gave the political power to the people to let them vote if they wanted slavery or not. And what land are we talking about here? If you remember correctly, that Mexican cession, that's the area that we're going to be talking about here. That Mexican cession area after the Mexican-American War, that's that gray area on that map. The United States got that land from Mexico, so now we have all this free land, and then something else crazy happens with the discovery of gold in California. Before we get there, in 1846, senators came up with the Wilmot Proviso, and what that said is that any type of land in that Mexican cession above that 3630 line is going to be free, below it is going to be slave. So northern abolitionists were all for it. Yes, let's do it. Let's pass this through. In 1848, the Free Soil Party supported this Wilmot Proviso. Yes, let's make it happen. Do you think the Southerners wanted it? Of course not. The Southerners that had anything that had to do against slavery would have nothing to do with it. So what we have is this sectionalism. Look at that little map right there. There's the West, the orange, the North, abolitionist North, the blue, the South, the red. The yellow in there, that was Native American territory, so we're not talking about that one right now. 1849, all that gold is discovered in California, and hundreds of thousands of immigrants are rushing there. All of a sudden, bam, they become eligible for statehood. So they apply for statehood. Now, here's the problem. The Southerners didn't want California to become a free state, because if it became a free state, it would cause another imbalance in the Senate, giving the Northern abolitionist states more representation, and they wouldn't have that. So that's really at the heart of the debate about California. If you look at the line, right, that 3630 line, if you look at the map, it would split California by the time it got over here. So California had to make a decision: free state, slave state, one of each. You know, do we have one senator of each? And they apply to become a free state. And what you can't see down here, because now I'm just blocking it with everything, that name is Henry Clay, Henry Clay. Henry Clay, a senator, comes up with what we call the Compromise of 1850. And here's what he comes up with. He says California would enter the Union as a free state, giving the North what they wanted, appeasing the North, that free state, more representation. And the South would get something called a Fugitive Slave Act, or a Fugitive Slave Law, that would really benefit the South. They had to appease the South. He's trying to satisfy the South. To get California to come in as a free state, we have to do something. We have to compromise. And what does the South love more in the 1850s than being able to control their slaves? So here's what this Fugitive Slave Act, when it passes, what it allows the Southerners. Texas could give up the land east of the upper Rio Grande, and in return the federal government would pay all Texas's debts from its independence war with Mexico. That's the first thing. The second thing is the slave trade, not slavery, just the slave trade, would end in Washington, D.C. So they still have slavery, they just won't trade them up there. And the rest of the Mexican cession would be federal land, and it would be decided by popular sovereignty, giving them the ability to vote for slavery if they want to or not. So this is going to benefit both sides. But there is one last thing about this Fugitive Slave Act that I want to get to before we get back to this picture here. Here's what the Fugitive Slave Act, here is the heart and soul of the Fugitive Slave Act. It made it a crime for Northerners to help runaway slaves, allowed officials to arrest runaway slaves in the free areas. So if you're in a free area, guess what? You're not free. Too bad. They would arrest you. Slaveholders could go to the North. They would collect escaped slaves, or free black people, or fugitives that they would call them, and incorporate them back into slavery, even if they were free. There was no proof of them being free. They would capture and bring them back down into slavery. Slaveholders could take suspected fugitives to U.S. commissioners, basically like judges who would decide their fate. These commissioners would pretty much get more money. I think it was like $10. They would get $10 to send this slave back down to slavery, but $5 to set them free. What would any judge do at that time? Any crooked judge, at least, any judge that liked money, they would take that money. So it's this Fugitive Slave Act in the South that really, really hurts a lot of the slaves. Besides slavery in general, the institution, this Fugitive Slave Act is really clamping down on slavery in the South, and it's forcing the Northerners to not be able to help them. This is why things like the Underground Railroad comes out. And just to tell you a story right quick, Anthony Burns, he was a slave in Virginia. He was able to make his way up to Boston, Massachusetts, free territory. He's a free man. So he writes a letter to his brother, says, hey man, you got to get up here to Boston. It's great. We're free around here. Everything's good. Well, because of this fugitive slave law, Burns's slave keeper traveled up to Boston, and even though hundreds or thousands at least of people were trying to protect Anthony Burns to keep him free in Boston, Polk stepped in and sent the army down there, the military down there, to get Burns and bring him back to his slave owner, back to the South. Right? So this is what the fugitive slave law really did. Now let's go back to this map real quick. Remember, here's that 3630 line. Prior to California, you had 30 senators and 30 senators. This is why it's important that California came in as a free. That gave the North 2 more senators. So remember, the Compromise of 1850 boiled down as this. California wanted to become a free state. They enter as a free state. The South gets that fugitive slave law.